She fell into a burning romance that could have scorched everything she was, except it didn't. The flame was not a spectacle. It was a private flare, a quick bright that licked the edges of her carefully arranged life and left a thin ring of soot where certainty used to sit. That soot would show up later in dinners not returned, in invitations that gathered dust on a table, in the way her bracelet clicked less often in public. For now it was only light and heat and the intoxicating sense of being seen. Yanlu arrived at the rooftop party knowing how light behaves on certain metals. When she moved, the bracelet near her wrist caught the chandelier's spill and sent a confident flash across the terrace. She had learned the choreography of attendance, the careful tilt of a champagne coupe, the measured laugh, the way one allowed a compliment to land and then reframed it as nothing. Belonging for her had always been a practiced gesture. The world applauded those who could perform it well. Tonight, the applause felt distant against the city's soft hum. The terrace unfurled like a map of small concessions, glass railings, a bar where ice chimed like distant bells, clusters of people who had agreed to be seen together. Yanlu navigated them with the same precision she used to fold napkins, deliberate, sure. Conversations angled away from the real. Someone mentioned an exhibition, someone else a new restaurant. The skyline pressed a jagged tooth line of neon against the night. In that light, the bracelet looked like a promise, polished, intact, a seal on an identity she had curated. She liked how it announced her without needing words. He was standing by the edge, half in shadow, hands in the pockets of a coat that had somehow been cut to look unbothered. G called himself G in the curt, enigmatic way some people do when they want to be interesting without giving anything up. He was not a man of loud declarations. He offered small observations like someone who read the room as one reads tea leaves. He noticed the bracelet first, a flicker of interest at the curve of her wrist. Then he noticed the way she watched the city, not for the skyline itself, but for the brief private moments where the lights hummed out of sync and anyone could imagine escape. He tapped a lighter twice and the small sound punctured the din. Lighter, pause, lighter, pause. The ritual underlined his manner, precise, quiet. She found herself standing close enough that the heat from his body brushed her sleeve. The air smelled faintly of star anise and smoke. For no particular reason, she told herself she would learn the movement of his hands. Later, she would not be able to say why. They talked like two people testing the margins of a conversation. G revealed small, telling things, an affection for thrifted books, a habit of always carrying a pen, a reluctance to ask for dessert.
Yanlu answered with answers that fit well into the impression she wanted to leave. Amused, slightly ironic, not clinging. The terrace felt like an amphitheater in miniature. Below them the city moved, unaware. They stepped away from the groups as if retreating into a private room. Light bent differently there, softer at the edges. A cigarette lighter clicked twice again. His hand brushed the bracelet, and the metal chimed. It was such a small contact that it scarcely registered as touching, but it registered as an acknowledgement. It made Yanlu feel visible in a way that invitations and embossed cards had never quite managed. She allowed herself to be buoyed by the sensation. It was dangerous, she knew, not because it would be loud, the romance would not explode with fireworks, but because it would rearrange how she looked at herself. The flame did not need to consume, it only needed to warm. They returned to the party after the terrace, rejoining the carefully curated clusters. The rest of the evening passed with the kind of courtesy that is almost indistinguishable from intimacy, a shared joke here, an exchanged glance there. He left his coat in her apartment when he stumbled, slightly sick with wine and charm, and she found a note folded in a cigarette packet by the sink the next morning. It read only, in a hand that reminded her of newspaper crosswords, for later. Later became a small promise between them, a private bookend to meetings and messages. The bracelet glinted now and then as a witness. That week the city liked her. Invitations arrived handwritten and gilded. There were lunches with curators, a dinner at a place where the staff knew precisely which bottle to open. Yanlu moved through it all like someone in a costume she loved, comfortable, commanding. But she could not stop thinking of the lighter clicking twice, the way G had watched the hem of her sleeve as if he were cataloging something precious. She had always kept an eye for other people's soft places. She had never before felt so exposed in her own. One afternoon, 2 weeks after the party, she found a boarding pass tucked inadvertently beneath a stack of napkins on her desk. It was the size and shape of a small betrayal. The printed name, G, and a departure airport blurred across glossy paper. Beneath it, in the same folded cigarette packet where she had once found for later, a new note, "I'm leaving. There may be someone else." The handwriting was blunt as a closed door. It is strange how facts can arrive like stones and change the slope of a life. The boarding pass itself was a small, inert thing, but the knowledge it carried shifted the geometry of Yanlu's evenings. Her friends suggested interpretations with the gentle cruelty of those who watch from the outside. He had always been a nomad. He never wanted permanence. He was not made for the kind of domestic life she had always imagined.
Lin Tai, who had a manner like an unvarnished truth, said nothing coy. "He's left you a burn mark. Don't let it keep smoldering." Lin Tai's words landed and made a small, irritable heat under her ribs. The social calendar frayed soon after. Invitations that had once arrived like warm letters were no longer so eagerly produced. RSVP lines that had shortened for her presence began to lengthen without explanation. Luncheons passed with an odd thinness. Eyes slid from her. Conversations paused unexpectedly. People who had been quick to include her in a white-gloved way now called to her less. There was no public humiliation. There was only a reconfiguration of proximity. The city that had applauded her distanced itself. Humiliation in that narrow sense is a domestic animal. It moves quietly, not with horns but with the soft step of withdrawal. It turned up in small gestures, another host reserving a seat at the center of a table rather than opposite her, a murmur of a "did you hear?" that dissolved when she glanced toward it. These were not catastrophic things. They were the sorts of minor omissions that rearrange a life over a slow season. Yanlu felt the caloric decline of social currency. The weight of her bracelet was suddenly a thing to be shifted under a sleeve. Before Yanlu could decide if she would leave the city's edges for somewhere vaguer, the life she had managed like a collection of delicate glass items required tending. Mr. Lee collapsed in the kitchen. Mr. Lee had been less a servant than an anchor, a man whose steady hands kept the household from tipping. He had been there longer than her friends had known her. His hands could remember precisely how to roll dumplings, how to press thin dough, how to move a delicate scoop of congee from pot to bowl without spilling a grain. He carried the house's quiet history in the small dents of his tin cans, in a dent on the back of a spoon, in the exact placement of a cookbook on the lower shelf. When the ambulance light sliced the street, Yanlu felt something old give way in the chest as if a hinge had been loosened. Hospital rooms are arithmetic of odor and noise, antiseptic, plastic, the long, low hum of machinery. Dr. Lin spoke with the bureaucratic kindness of someone who had held too many worried hands. Blood pressure, pulses, a steady watch. Mr. Lee's face was pale and familiar as a photograph held at an odd angle. In his pocket, when they found it, was a folded piece of paper and a small USB drive bound by yellow tape. The letter was written in Mr. Lee's careful hand. The words themselves were spare, precise in the way of someone who had a lifetime of tasks and no taste for drama. "If anything happens to me," the letter said, "please keep him in the kitchen of his life." He had written that phrase as if it were a recipe: weight, measurement, clarity. He meant Jaw. The paper gave Jaw's name and a few facts: age, his proclivity for marbles, a fondness for soup.
The USB drive contained his recorded voice, a practice Mr. Lee had indulged in over small, practical moments. A recipe explained slowly, a list of allergies, a counseled sentence about how to make broth that would soothe a stubborn child. The voice said simple things that felt enormous when heard in a small player. Teach him to tear the ginger. Let the soup simmer until it remembers warmth. There was no melodramatic legal ultimatum. The paper and the drive were pragmatic. They were only instructions. They carried no emotion designed to compel. Yet their existence forced a choice. Yanlu sat in the hospital corridor with the letter folded into her palm and felt as if a new geography had been drawn without her consent. The city's outline blurred at the edges. The boy arrived a day later, Jaw, with a scraped knee and a handful of marbles rattling in his pocket like rain. He was smaller than she had pictured, his hair flattened against his skull, his eyes large with the unprocessed shock of displacement. He did not know how to ask a question that would pull the world back into order. Instead, he offered marbles and a single, steady stare. He had a bruise neat and dark on his thigh, the kind of wound that reads as history at once. He clutched the marbles, the small glass orbs that had probably once been toys, and now served as the closest thing he owned that made sense to manage. Jaw knew soup like someone who had learned to understand a language through broth. He could name the difference between a chili that made the tongue bright and a broth that uncurled a cold evening. He was small enough to rest his chin on the edge of the low table and watch the water boil until he had something to show for waiting. The marbles told Yanlu things before the boy had spoken much. They clinked and rolled and moved down wooden tracks between his knees. They were, Mr. Lee had written, his ledger of presence. The legal tedium that followed felt at once both ridiculous and decisive. There were forms that required her signature, a notarized thing here, a governmental page there that asked for names and references and proof that she was suitable. The process bureaucratized intimacy. The paperwork asked for the way the world chooses to define family. The papers wanted proof. In one small room full of sterile geometry, Yanlu signed her name until it felt like a stamp.
It was a mundane, almost humiliating exercise in officialdom, someone checking boxes on a life she had not anticipated keeping. There were also small humiliations that had nothing to do with official penstrokes. Ja's school forms listed Yanlu's name in a way that made it seem suddenly institutional. Friends asked awkward, polite questions at parties from which she could no longer accept the same comfortable seat. Some of these awkwardnesses she could foresee.
Others cut faster because they were so ordinary. The furtive glance that meant an invitation had been rescinded, the way a host's eyes slid past her. The city trimmed its affections in a slow, geometric way, and Yanlu felt as if a delicate fabric were being cut at the seams. Inside the apartment, the domestic training began with Ginger. Mr. Lee's USB voice explained the method in patient detail. Tear the ginger with your fingers, not the knife. Let the fibers remain. Yanlu found the instruction almost fiercely intimate. She learned how to break the ginger into its own rhythm, how the act with tearing something apart could be an art of repair. She would stand at the counter and tear, feeling the stringy pieces between her fingers like small confidences. Ja watched, learned, and mimicked. They practiced the motion with the sort of silence that is pregnant with learning. There is no need for words when hands know what to do. Soup making became a study in patience and small mercy. The broth required time and a watchfulness that was unfamiliar to Yanlu, who had been used to the quick, theatrical gestures life demanded of her before. Here, the kitchen asked for waiting. She learned to skim the scum with a practiced flick of the wrist, to time carves of meat so they would fall apart properly, to count the minutes not as signals but as gifts. The smell of star anise and simmering broth claimed the apartment in layers. It existed like a slow reclamation project. There were moments that suggested flight. Sometimes when the boy slept and the city hummed far off, Yanlu would let herself reread the email notifications tucked into a folder labeled G on her phone. One message remained unopened for days, an incoming note that might have been an apology, an explanation, a door left slightly ajar. She told herself she was preserving options by not opening it. In truth, the silence of the unread mail was a test she did not trust her resolve to pass. Lin Tai observed these flinches with bluntness and a rare tenderness. She had helped set Yanlu's life like a table before, and was not a woman apt to romanticize the messiness of human hearts. "What do you want?" she asked one night as they stood on a neighbor's balcony and watched the same skyline where Yanlu had once been noticed by many. It was less rhetorical than it seemed. Lin Tai's question arrived wearing plain clothes. It had no decorative answer. Yanlu felt the question like a small blade of wind through an opening. The temptation to escape was not nobly cinematic. It arrived in the shape of quiet fantasies, a whim to sell the apartment and move to a city with small streets where no one knew her bracelet's song, the small daydream of packing a single suitcase with all the things one needs and stepping on a train to a town where she would not have to be anything for anyone.
But as the days forced their soft insistence on her, lunching with Ja on trays, teaching him to count marbles in sets of 6, listening to Mr. Lee's voice on the USB as if it were a talisman, something else tightened in her chest, a steady, odd warmth that could have been responsibility, or habit, or the embryonic shape of affection. There were scenes of humiliation, to be sure. A bank clerk asked for identification as if Yanlu were a minor. Her signature was compared to the one on a previous page, as if to check for cunning. She waited at counters, held strange forms that felt like tests. People in official offices moved with bureaucratic indifference, and there was nowhere to hide. But humiliation did not so much injure her as reframe what she considered important. The bracelet, once an emblem of the world's applause, found itself polished at home by hands that had learned a different kind of reverence. It was still a signature, but its sheen no longer commanded rooms. Home asked for other proofs. One afternoon, weeks into the new arrangement, Yanlu received a question she had been avoiding. What would she do with the unread email from G? The mail sat in the corner of her phone like a coiled ember. She had told herself stories to justify not opening it. Perhaps the absence of an explanation was an explanation in itself. Perhaps she was protecting some fragile piece. The ember burned at the edge of thought. Mr. Lee's USB message became a kind of liturgy. It was a voice that repeated practicalities as if enacting a spell. Marbles are important. Keep them in a jar where he can see them. Teach him to count. Teach him to offer soup before he asks. It was strange to be given instructions by a man whose hands were known more for action than for speech.
There was tenderness in the way he spoke. There was also the authority of someone who knows the contours of another person's life and lays them down like careful bricks. The mansion of her previous life contracted into a single apartment that required care. Yanlu began cataloging the objects that mattered. The cookbook with its grease-splattered spine was lifted from the shelf and used until its pages softened. Recipes were annotated in the margins with notes in a language the book had never expected. The marbles were washed and placed in a mason jar. The bracelet took a morning on a week when Jaw was at school, a blink of polish across the metal until it responded to the light like an old friend greeting her. The social world did not stage a single concentrated betrayal. It receded with the even sadness of an ocean tide. Invitations continued to arrive in perfunctory ways, but the names on the envelopes changed. Where there once had been lively notations in familiar hands, now there was polite distance. Yanlu felt the shift like a map slowly being redrawn. She missed some parts of it in the way one misses the warmth of a sunlit stare. She did not weep dramatic tears.
She felt instead a small, stubborn resolve. There is a kind of dignity in finishing the last spoonful of soup for a child, whose needs must be measured out like rationed gold. Her nights were sometimes haunted by memory. The lighter tapped twice on the terrace, the way G had brushed against the bracelet, the glow that had felt like possibility and a mirror. The lure of the private flame remained an ache, an ember that could be coaxed into a larger fire with one small negligent act. But other things occupied her. The swivel of Jaw's small head when she read to him, the soft chink of marbles against one another at bedtime, the steady, mundane joy of a pot that had learned to simmer without scorching. Then, in a hospital corridor smoothed by time and antiseptic, she listened to Mr. Lee's recorded voice for the first time, with the weight of the new life upon her. He spoke as if leaving a recipe for a future she had not yet earned. If you can, teach him to make the soup we used to make when he was feverish. Let the broth be the thing that says, I am here. Keep the marbles in a jar. When you hear the lighter click twice, do not run. Those last words, do not run, were not a command but a request. The phrase settled into her like a seed. Yanlu did not know then whether it would grow into a tree or only a tendril. She tucked the USB back into a small wooden box and closed it like a volume whose spine she could not yet open in public. There was one evening where everything pivoted on the arc of a question. Lin Tai, Jaw at the ready with a fistful of marbles and a face that oscillated between fatigue and fierce curiosity, stood with Yanlu on the roof where the two of them had once watched the city as if it were a stage. The skyline scanned us in indifferent light. Lin Tai looked at Yanlu with an economy of gestures and asked simply, "What do you want?" Yanlu felt the question as she felt the press of a hot air current, immediate, clarifying. The burning romance had been a bright private heat, G's lighter, the click of promise. It had almost ruined her, in the sense that it had forced a rethinking of how she wanted to be seen, how much of herself she would barter away for the warmth of another. But here, with Jaw at her feet rolling a marble toward the edge of the parapet, and Lin Tai waiting for an answer, the question was less about romance and more about what life she wanted to practice. "I can teach him to make the soup," Yanlu said, and the sentence did not need ornament. It was not a heroic vow. It was a small logistical promise. It was enough. The rooftop breeze took the words and rearranged them into the city's indifferent hymn. Below, the lights continued their indifferent work. The bracelet glinted when she moved her hand, catching the last smear of sunlight. Jaw rolled a marble and watched it travel until it stopped. He clapped at the smallness of the achievement like a person who discovers a new sound. That night, she did not open the unread email. She did not go to an airport. She folded the boarding pass into a corner of a table drawer and shut it. The manuscript of a previous life lay not burned, but shelved. The days that followed were less like acts of heroism and more like exercises, counting marbles in rows, teaching a child how to study his hands, simmering soups until they were just right. The bracelet was polished and put back on after one small ritual of acceptance. She ran her thumb along its curve and felt the tiny, recognizable imperfection, a faint dent where Mr. Lee had once knocked it against a copper pot in conversation, and smiled because it referenced a history she could still keep. There were mornings that began with the USB drive playing Mr. Lee's voice like a litany. When he is angry, give him elderflower tea. When he is quiet, offer him a bowl. His recorded instructions mapped out an unglamorous theology of care. For Yanlu, the practice of such rituals made visible what had been invisible. They made of her hands something that could create steadiness. But the question of G lingered at the house's edges. An unopened mail sat like a talisman she was not ready to desecrate. Sometimes she found herself tracing the edge of the boarding pass and feeling the friction as if it were a seam to be picked. The city, meanwhile, reallocated its favors. People who had once sought her company simply drifted into new constellations. She felt the absence with the muted grief of someone who notices a missing tooth when she laughs. Weeks after Mr. Lee's collapse, as the arrangements became more settled, a slow, cautious routine emerged. Ja began school and learned to bring his marbles home each day to show the rims of the jar, and then watch them rattle into place. His appetite for soup grew from necessity into an aesthetic. He preferred certain broths for certain moods. Yanlu deciphered his small rituals and began to plan meals like a person planning an offering. Important work awaited in places with no theater. She attended appointments, signed papers, and practiced small domestic ceremonies like polishing the spoon before serving, or carefully tucking the marbles into a drawer labeled, "Someday." The bracelet no longer functioned as an emblem of entrance into rooms. It functioned as a relic of her former self she had chosen not to discard. At moments of private doubt, she could imagine the flame rekindled into something that would scorch rather than warm. The possibility of running flirted with her in quiet forms: an impulsive visa application, a new apartment listing, the seductive click of a plane's booking site. There was always, lurking, the knowledge that a single open message or a sudden departure could flip the script. But each choice was now tempered by another presence: a small boy who loved marbles and broth, and who rolled his eyes when she fussed over the proper temperature of soup. The household adopted rituals like patches on a coat. The cookbook, with its grease-stained spine, acquired marginalia in her hand. Add more star anise is winter. Do not overstep the ginger. The marbles were inventoried weekly and placed in the jar in color order, a small, reassuring geometry. The bracelet was sometimes slipped off and left beside the recipe book while she cooked, a slow, deliberate gesture. One afternoon, the kind where sunlight moves through the kitchen in thin streams, and the radio downstairs murmurs a show about some civic event, Yanlu found herself plugged in to Mr. Lee's recording again. His voice said, with the steady authority of someone who knew that fidelity is learned in repetition, "Keep him in the kitchen of his life. Let the broth be the first word he recognizes when he wakes. Teach him to place the marbles back in the jar with intention." The instructions were unadorned, but they held an enormous tenderness. They were not commands for glory, they were the small devices of survival. Listening, Yanlu understood the scale of what she had said yes to. It was not dramatic. It was not an act of public righteousness. It was, instead, a slow reallocation of energy and presence. At night, when the city's neon was a distant bruise, Yanlu would sometimes stand by her window and watch the lighter-lit residue of a romance she'd been part of flicker in her memory. There was no blinding flame now. It was an ember, contained. The idea that it had almost ruined her felt, in the quiet hours, like a lesson. The danger of any private fire is not only in its potential to consume, but in its ability to reconfigure the person tending it. She felt neither shame nor triumph, only the resolute, somewhat weary satisfaction of someone who had reoriented. She would wake the next morning to the sound of marbles clattering on wood, jaw practicing a trick of speed, and would move toward the kitchen where the broth would simmer and create its slow, honest heat. She would take the bracelet out of the drawer and slip it on the wrist that had learned to measure out soup with a steady hand. Somewhere inside that motion lay a decision that felt less like capitulation and more like the beginning of method. The city kept its indifference and its invitations. The email from G remained unread, a potential rupture she had elected not to open. The acts of keeping jaw, not for spectacle, not for reward, began to define an interior architecture she had not planned but that fit in the end. The bracelet caught light and did not demand applause. The marbles clinked and did not remind her of the world outside. The cookbook lay open, pages softened, ready for annotations. On a gray morning when rain was only a promise, a call came from the hospital. There were formalities to finish, signatures to reassert custodial arrangements, a meeting with Dr. Lin to confirm Mr. Lee's condition and the plans ahead.
In the narrow waiting room with its vinyl chairs and posters about recovery, Yanlu folded the letter once more and slipped it into her pocket, next to the small wooden box that held the USB. The recorded voice she had learned to treat like an instruction manual was now a warrant for the life she had chosen to build. She left the hospital carrying not just a child, but an entire choreography of care that would ask of her things she had never practiced before. She did not feel ruined, she felt retooled. The almost ruin was a geography she had passed through toward a new map. But she also felt the latent question that would not go away. Would she, when the lighter clicked twice again in her life, run or stay?
Jia rolled a marble into the palm of her hand the moment they entered the apartment, as if to answer that question in advance. The marble was cool and ordinary. It made a small sound, not the sound of a bell, but of something that can be counted, and thus trustable. Yanlu set the marble down on the table and listened to the simmering of soup in the kitchen, and for the first time in a long while thought that perhaps tending an ember is an act of courage that does not require triumph, only persistence. The days that followed the decision settled into a slow architecture of repetition. Mornings began with the same small invocation: water put on before coffee, a cloth folded to catch stray parsley, the marbles jarred and set where Jia could reach them but not overturn the order they kept. Yanlu learned to measure grief and responsibility in kitchen increments. She measured out rice by eye, tasted broths as if reading a weathered map, and let the apartment fill with the live, domestic music of simmering. Each sound was an argument in favor of staying. If you want to follow Yanlu's choice, stay with us and see how careful tending changes a life. There was practical work to be done that could not be softened into metaphor. The custody forms had to be filed, signatures procured, a calendar negotiated with a school that wanted immunization records and a certified letter acknowledging guardianship. Paper became the ledger of her commitment, each stamp a small bone of proof. Meetings with a social worker were held in rooms furnished with sensible chairs and bland posters about community resources. A woman named Miss Calder asked practical questions in a voice that assumed the worst and hoped for the best. "Who will care for him when you're at work?" she asked, not accusatory so much as thorough. Yanlu answered with details, names, times, backup plans, so that the stranger could tick boxes on a form and go home. There was no ceremony in it, only the clean necessity of making a life legible to institutions. Those institutional necessities collided sometimes with the residual economy of her old social world. Invitations did not so much stop as transform. Old friends called with measured warmth, but new faces replaced old ones at long tables.
A woman who had once sat beside Yanlu at openings recommended a nanny agency whose manager used the word suitable in ways that made Yanlu feel assessed rather than invited. Humiliation came in the small, non-spectacular ways that are hardest to narrate. The brief pause when a host's hand hovered over the phone to look up someone's name, and seeing hers, chose instead to text rather than include. These were omissions, not declarations. Still, they established a new perimeter for Yanlu's evenings. Within that perimeter, she built work that had a sound and smell and sequence. Soup making was central, because soup is both a tool and a language. She learned finally to let a stock do its slow work, bones browned, water coaxed, scum skimmed. There was an almost sacramental pleasure in the act of lowering a spoon into a pot and finding a flavor that arranged itself like a small reconciliation. Jia watched her do these things, and repeated them badly, and then better, like someone learning a new alphabet. He learned to wedge his small fingers under a spoonful of ginger to feel the fibers, to respect how the heat flexed them. Once, with a solemnity that made Yanlu laugh and then hold back a tear, he said, "This one heals," and took a sip. Mr. Lee's voice from the USB remained a private architecture for the house. At odd moments, she would press play and listen to his deliberate instructions or his small reminiscences about markets and teachers. His voice was not a substitute for his physical presence. Rather, it acted like a map, faint lines that guided hands not yet used to the routes. He explained, once, in a clip tone that carried a faint smile, how to choose a jar for marbles. Find one that is clear enough for him to see the world inside, heavy enough not to tip. She followed the advice exactly. The glass jar she chose lived on the low shelf for Jia's reach, and the sight of the marbles collected in it became, most days, a sentence that read, "You are contained, you are counted." Small rituals bound them. Before school, Jia arranged his marbles in rows of 3 as if testing an answer. In the evenings, they read from the cookbook not as an heirloom to be shown to guests, but as a manual for a life they would assemble together. Yanlu wrote notes in the margins. Less star anise, more fennel here. Hands that had once signed embossed cards now making tiny private edits. On Saturdays, they went to a market that smelled of wet cardboard and citrus. Yanlu taught him to bargain, not for show, but for the sensible pleasure of saving a few coins. When Jia misplaced a marble, the search for it became a lesson in attention. Look under the chair, in the pocket of the jacket, behind the radiator. Finding it was a small recovery, and the marble returned to the jar with the solemnity of a ritual. There were tests that were not orchestrated, but inevitable. A school teacher called one autumn to request a parent-teacher conference.
Yanlu sat in a rectangular room with a poster of multiplication tables behind her and watched as the teacher, mild, efficient, spoke of Jia's progress. "He's attentive when you cook with him," she said, "and he shows a real interest in patterns." That small notice felt more satisfying than any applause. It proved that something practical, measurable, had been accomplished. Yanlu left the meeting with an odd currency, a momentum that could be counted in homework, and a report card of small growth. Lin Tai arrived in the middle of this steady work, with blunt assessments and practical gifts. She brought a bag of second-hand aprons and a thermos of tea, and once a set of enamel bowls that had come from her mother's kitchen. She prodded with the efficiency of someone who believes tenderness must be practiced. "You will be lonely sometimes," she said frankly, setting down the bowls. "And you'll be embarrassed sometimes. But look at him." Jaw, who had overheard, pressed his palm into Lin Tai's, and then turned to Yanlu to show a trick he'd learned with marbles. He could make two click together without them falling. Lin Tai took them seriously only as tokens of durability. "You can build a life with these," she said, "and build it so solidly people won't notice the scaffolding." Temptation did not vanish because of new routines. It persisted as a thin, luminous possibility. The unread email sat like a waiting ember on her phone, its subject line a half-remembered chord. There were nights when she would touch the screen as if to open the message, and then slide the thumb away. Sometimes she imagined its contents, an apology, an explanation, a portrait of a life that might have been, and then let the image dissipate like steam. The act of not opening it became an exercise in testing herself. Each time she resisted, the unread mail lost some of its charge. Later, after months, the subject line remained, but the desire to know it dimmed until it was simply another notification like the rest. G receded into the background in the way that weather recedes, present enough to be noticed but not commanding. A mutual acquaintance mentioned once in a conversation about artistic residencies that G had been in Lisbon for a year. Someone else had said he had published an essay about solitude. Yanlu heard these facts as if from across a courtyard and felt no impulse to run toward or away from them. They were the life he had chosen, not an indictment of hers. The potential for flame was reduced on her end to a lesson, how close to the heat she wanted to stand and what she would sacrifice for a larger glow. Financial realities pressed in, as they always do. The city that had once lavished gifts now required receipts. Medical bills, school fees, and ordinary rent demanded her attention in a ledger of choices. She sold a few pieces she rarely wore and learned to budget in a way that made room for unexpected expenses. There was a small shame here, an old vanity given over to practical accounting, but also a relief. It simplified the kinds of decisions that had once seemed culturally important and left only the choices that actually sustained life. There were small towns of kindness that appeared unexpectedly. A neighbor, whose dog Jaw sometimes walked with him, brought over dumplings on a rainy evening and didn't ask questions. A shopkeeper taught Jaw how to count change. A retired teacher across the hall offered to take him for a weekly reading session. These gestures were not headline-making. They were the accumulation of a neighborhood's willingness to attach itself, in small ways, to a new shape of family. Yanlu felt gratitude as a daily, low-level warmth, and sometimes she answered with the only currency she knew, time and presence. She always brought soup. One rainy afternoon, months into the tenure of her new life, the social services office called for a final verification visit. A man in a tidy jacket entered their home with a clipboard, an amiable professional whose job was to ensure that the architecture of domestic care matched what had been promised on paper. He moved like an inspector who had pleasant work, opening cabinets, checking locks, observing the location of the marble jar. He listened when Jaw recited the recipe for broth in a proud rush. When he asked Yanlu if she had anyone to call him in emergency, she named a neighbor and Lin Tai and the school's front office. The man's notes ended with a sentence that felt, in its bureaucratic way, like validation. Home suitable, guardian demonstrated consistent caregiving. There was no public announcement of her victory. No one delivered a bouquet. But when the inspector left, Jaw ran to the window and rolled a marble down the sill and watched it catch in the light. He clapped with a fierceness that made Yanlu laugh. It was an ordinary joy, the sound of a child who knows he is safe. The household continued to accrue its small objects of meaning. The cookbook's pages bent further with marginalia. The bracelet, sometimes left beside the sink while she cooked, began to inhabit a new set of associations. It caught light the way a memory catches on the edge of a sentence, not a demand for an entrance, but a companion to a life now fully occupied with the needs of another human. Once, when she polished it, she noticed a tiny dent, Mr. Lee's dent, as if the house itself had left its print on the object. She kept the dent and wore the bracelet precisely because it bore evidence of a life that had more than one author. There were inevitably nights when the city called to old habits. An acquaintance invited her to a new show, Another texted photos of a gala where gowns moved like corollaries and wines were praised with exactitude. For a while these messages cut through her, sharpened the sense of public absence, but they also became like postcards from a country she had chosen not to inhabit.
When she resisted answers, she did so with fewer pangs each time. The life that had almost been dissolved by a small burning passion had, through the slow work of tending, found its anchor. One evening, in late winter, Mr. Lee's condition required her to visit the hospital again, not for him this time, but for final formalities and to speak with the nurse about a memorial shelf she could place in the apartment. The hospital smelled the same as before, antiseptic and boiled tea. Yet in the small vestibule where families placed instant coffee cups and folded programs, Yanlu felt an odd steadiness. There was a sense of closure that had nothing to do with dramatic pronouncements and everything to do with a continuity of practice. The nurse, an older woman with a voice softened by experience, handed her a small folded card that Mr. Lee had left to be read. It contained nothing scandalous or theatrical, a sentence about the market, a recall of a jar of marbles, an instruction to teach him the soup as I taught you. The card landed like a punctuation mark. Back in the apartment, Ja grew bolder with his culinary practice. One afternoon, he announced with the absolute seriousness children reserve for truths that he could make a bowl of soup by himself. Yanlu stood at the counter and watched him move. Water measured, a strip of ginger torn away with careful fingers, a spoon used to taste. He did not yet have the finesse of a practiced cook, but the bones of method were there. The first bowl was uneven, but when he brought it to the table and placed it before her with both hands, his eyes luminous with effort, she felt something like proof. He waited for her reaction. She tasted it, savoring the unformed flavors and the conviction behind them, and said simply, "Good. It will be even better next time." Days telescoped into months, and the household found its cadence. The marbles jarred, the cookbook read, the bracelet shone when it could, the pot on the stove hummed an even yellow heat. The scope of what had almost ruined her felt, in this steady light, more precise. The romance had been a flame bright enough to illuminate cracks. It had not burned the house down. It had instead exposed seams and invited her to sew them. Her friends, those whose presence had shifted, returned in unpredictable ways. Lintai remained constant, less for drama than for a shared habit of meals, and a few others reappeared at different times. Some relationships could not find the previous rhythm, others adapted, quieter and truer. None of it was theatrical. There were apologies offered in low tones. There were invitations that arrived with an honesty she had not always known how to expect. "We'd like you to come by when it's convenient," one note read. Yanlu took each one on its merits. She did not seek to reclaim a social currency she had once spent. She was content to accept what fit into the life she tended. On a soft afternoon, while Ja arranged marbles by color and the radio spoke of the weather, Yanlu found herself tapping the edge of the drawer where the boarding pass lived. For months she had left it folded and untouched, an artifact of a life she had once considered leaving. Now she smoothed it out and held it for a moment, feeling the gloss and the small abrasions at its corner. The temptation to tear it up occurred to her, but instead she slid it into an envelope and placed it inside the cookbook as if to file it under past. The move was symbolic, but not theatrical. She did not need to burn evidence to prove she'd survived. There came a letter slightly later, written in a careful hand, from a woman who introduced herself as a colleague of G's. The message was brief, a note of thanks for a conversation they had shared at a reading. It was neutral, uncharged, mundane. Yanlu read it, folded it, and placed it in the same cookbook. The unread email remained untouched. The final tests of resilience came not as dramatic confrontations, but as habitual proofs. Ja weathered his first winter sickness with a fever that made him sulky and small, but the broth warmed him. He slept with a marble under his pillow during a particularly long night and woke with a grin. Yanlu sat up with him, mopping his forehead, whispering a recipe into his ear so he could remember warmth as a language. The acts of tending stitched them both into a seam that required no public recognition. In time, the bracelet's presence changed again. It became more often a thing slipped on after polishing, then left while she mixed batter or tended a simmer so she could avoid the small hazards of catching metal on pot edges. Once, when Ja was older by a year and had learned to roll marbles in patterns that astonished neighbors, an acquaintance asked Yanlu, lightly, "Do you miss it, the old life?" She considered the question as she watched Ja roll a marble into the jar and count. The answer was composed of small truths, sometimes an echo, sometimes a curiosity, mostly a contentment that came from the knowledge that she had chosen a life that needed hands. The city continued to glitter at its edges,
Parties came and went with their precise music. Ji continued in the narratives of others to appear as a man whose life had its own arc. But the central fact of Yanlu's days had shifted. The flame that had been so bright on the terrace had become an ember, contained, tended, useful for warmth rather than spectacle. It had almost ruined her in the narrowly literal sense that it had compelled a recalculation of her identity, but it had not destroyed her. Instead, it taught her a different grammar of presence. On an ordinary afternoon of many small practices, Yanlu stood by the stove and watched Jia ladle his own soup into a bowl, the steam lifting in thin ribbons.
He carried it to the table without spilling, and when she tasted it, his face tilted with the hope that the world would declare it good. She smiled and nodded. Outside the window, the city continued its indifferent business. The bracelet on her wrist caught a slant of light and held it for a moment. She had been involved in a burning romance that almost ruined her life. The phrase fit like a map folded and then refolded, accurate in its cartography, but not in its final meaning. She had walked close to heat and had learned to step away from its most consuming paths. What remained was not the drama of survival, but the patient labor of keeping a child in the kitchen of his life. She had traded applause for the quiet authority of knowing how to make a broth that could say, "I am here." As the pot cooled and the marbles clicked gently in their jar, she closed the cookbook and set the wooden box that contained Mr. Lee's USB beside it. The bracelet glinted along her wrist, dent and all, like a small, honest scar. Jia rolled a marble into his palm and looked up at her, eyes steady. "Will you teach me how to make this one without stirring?" he asked, nodding to the pot. Yanlu pressed the marble into her palm, feeling its smooth weight, and said, "Yes, we'll do it together." Which would you choose, run or build? Comment below and tell us which ember you would tend. If this story held something for you, subscribe for more human stories that linger.